In this lecture, we're going to cover a lot of information over the effects of World War I on the United States. Now, we're only looking at about 3 years, but it's 3 years that are ripe with strife for the United States and the world. Many of the roots of World War I go back several years. We think of World War I when the United States got involved, but actually in Europe, it had started several years earlier. In 1914, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated in June, and then various nations go to war because of conflicting alliances, sometimes secret alliances, and so this leads all of Europe into war. And in the war, we see that there were a lot of reasons why the United States got involved in this alliance system. We have a couple of different alliances we need to understand. There was the Triple Entente. This was France, Great Britain, and Russia. And there was the Triple Alliance: Italy, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, sometimes those are called the Central Alliance because Bulgaria and others form, like Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Italy leaves the war, leaves the alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then Italy joins the United States, Great Britain, and France, and Russia in the Triple Entente, and they're also joined by Japan. So there's shifting alliances, things are changing. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that a lot of the information we got were from our allies, Great Britain and France. And look here at the chart that shows the amount of trade we were conducting with those nations as opposed to Italy or Germany. Now, Germany we were doing a lot of trade with, but we see that declining as the war drags on, largely because of blockades. Wilson, the president, Bryan, the Secretary of State, and the general public want neutrality. They don't want us to get involved with war. War is bad for business. War is bad for the economy. And the United States has these ties with France, with Britain, and so neutrality. If we could keep trading with everybody, that would have been the best. In Europe, and you see this little blue line over here between London, well, it's actually on the continent, all the way down past Paris. This was a line that the Germans had decided would be the most strategic to attack Paris. This is sometimes called the von Schifflin Plan. This was that Germany was going to rush in and get France while the Russians were getting organized and while the British were caught off guard. And what this kind of devolves into is the Western Front. And this is this trench system that runs from the North Sea all the way down to Switzerland. And you're going to see this as being kind of the big area of contention. When we're talking about the trenches, now this is kind of an idealized map, but this kind of gives you an idea of some of the ways that the war was fought on a day-to-day basis. There was the no man's land. Basically, if you got up above the trenches, you were target practice. And so a lot of people died going up into this no man's land, up and over as it was sometimes called. This frontline trench, and there was these series of trenches, and these ran for miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, across Europe and across various parts of the Western Front. Machine guns were being used, there was long-range artillery, there were tanks, there were airplanes, and a lot of these weapons were new weapons. They had not really been used very much before, especially tanks and World War I airplanes, so they weren't really sure how to use those and what kind of threats they posed. We think of the war starting because of the sinking of the luxury liner, the Lusitania. Well, this happens in May of 1915. The United States doesn't get involved for another couple of years. But the Lusitania, the sinking of this ship, and as you can see here, I've got some notices. This was an advertisement that the German embassy took out in a New York newspaper, the Times, telling people don't get on the Lusitania. Be careful about these ships. We are sinking ships that are sailing into the disputed waters around England. And once the ship is sunk and you have American lives lost, about 1,200 people were killed right off the coast of Ireland. People were watching the ship go down from the coast of Cork. And this upset a great many Americans. Germany did not want the United States to get involved, and so they put a stop to submarine warfare. But there were other issues at hand. For the United States, between 1910 and 1930, on our southern border, there was a revolution occurring, the Mexican Revolution, and this threatened to spill into the United States. And in fact, in January of 1915, troopers caught a person carrying plans back and forth between South Texas and Mexico. This is sometimes called the Plan of San Diego, Texas, along the Rio Grande border, with a plan to get United States' Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native American populations on board to join and rise up against the United States and take back the lost territory. And what the lost territory refers to is the land that Mexico had lost during the U.S.-Mexican War in 1846 to 1848. And so this plan was to recapture that land through an alliance between Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. And so this caused some panic in the United States. In January of 1916, there is a massacre. Pancho Villa, and you see his picture here, some of his troops stopped a train in Mexico. On that train were about 16 American miners and mining engineers. They were taken off the train and they were executed. This was in San Isabel, and this caused a lot of Americans to be upset. And then a few months later, in March of 1916, Villa's troops entered the United States near Columbus, New Mexico, and raided it. About 16 American civilians were killed during this raid before the troops were sent back. The United States then launched a punitive expedition to hunt down Villa, although they were never able to find him. So the unrest caused by the Mexican Revolution that spilled over into the United States caused a lot of concern. Now, Wilson, because the war was raging in Europe and there were problems south of the border as well, began preparing for war. In 1916, there were elections. Wilson proclaimed himself the peace candidate, and the slogan was, there's war going on, but he kept us out of war. By the end of that year, Germans were already seeking peace. So just a few months after the elections, Germans were already coming to Wilson, asking him to help sign a peace treaty. But then Germany resumed submarine warfare that had been put on halt after the sinking of the Lusitania. This angered Wilson and concerned him, and so he ended diplomatic relations with Germany. And then there was the interception of the Zimmermann telegram. Here's a picture of the Zimmermann telegram, this Western Union telegram, and you can see it's coded. And what it did was it encouraged Mexico to join forces with the Germans. Zimmermann was the German foreign minister, and he had sent this note to the president of Mexico saying, join us against the United States and you'll get that lost land back. So here again was another threat that the United States was going to lose territory, and this very much concerned Wilson and the United States. People like in Texas were very upset about this, and this led to the road to war. And what's going to happen eventually is that the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who wanted peace, is going to resign over this because he fears that we're moving closer and closer to war. Across the seas in Russia, the Romanov monarchy falls to the Bolsheviks, and so they pull Russia out of the war effort. And so on the Eastern Front is no longer viable because the Russians signed this peace treaty with the Germans. Then the Germans are free to turn their attention to the West. So they began attacking U.S. merchant ships, and on April the 2nd, President Wilson goes to Congress and asks for war, saying that the world must be made safe for democracy. And on Good Friday, April the 6th, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. the United States was concerned about people who weren't behind the war effort. And so there's a couple of acts, one in 1917 and one in 1918, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, basically made it very difficult for anyone to oppose the war, and made it difficult for anyone to say bad things about the war, or maybe even to, write anything negative about the war. And you see this very vague terminology, right? That anybody who was seen giving aid by spreading lies, anyone who was writing or publishing, quote unquote, any abusive or disloyal language about the government. Now, this is very broad terms, and it can be interpreted many different ways. And so this was seen as kind of a way of kind of squashing any criticism of the war effort. In January of 1918, the United States started preparing for war. Wilson made a speech calling for 14 points of what the world would look like after the war was over. And in this, he most famously outlines his plans for a League of Nations. This was a way for the various nations to come together and to meet and to work out their differences so that they wouldn't have to go to war. We also began preparing for war. We had the first time a draft passed, a Selective Services Act, to recruit people to war. There was a Food Administration to regulate food production and distribution, war industries to channel businesses to make war goods and war materials and machines of war. And there was also publicity. The Committee on Public Information's job was to promote the war through mass campaigns. Now, you've got a little poster here on the right saying that, everybody could pitch in, that don't leave anything on your plate. Make sure you're eating and not wasting food that could better be used for soldiers. And so this was this idea that everybody should be involved, that it was total war, that everyone played a part. And there were setbacks early on in this effort. Once the United States gets involved, at least vocally, in the war, we halted the German threat to shipping. And that sounds good, right, is that we were protecting the seas. However, at the same time, as I mentioned, there was the Bolshevik Revolution. The Russians pulled out, and they signed this treaty with the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Also, the Germans were rallying. They were pushing back, and this really threatened the Allied forces. In fact, the Germans got all the way to about 50 miles of Paris, and it looked like they might take France. When the United States entered, it's not until about September of 1918, and so we spent almost a year trying to get ready for war. General John J. Pershing was in charge of the troops. He had been the general leading the expeditionary force against in Mexico against Pancho Villa. He's brought back and now sent to Europe. By the time we get involved in 1918, we're beginning to penetrate towards the Mise-Argonne forest, and you can see that there in green, dark green. And this was to cut the German supply lines, and by October, the Allies are able to push the line all the way back to the German border. So the American reinforcement of the Allied troops kind of gave them that push that they needed to help push back the Germans from near Paris all the way back to their own border. And this forced the Germans to ask for peace. And finally, on 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns went silent, and the armistice agreed to that time to end the war. And so World War I came to an end. Now, look at the losses and look at what it cost various countries. This was dead, 2 million dead in Germany, almost 2 million in Russia, 1.5 million in France. The United States got off relatively light. We weren't involved that long, but we came in and we kind of helped turn the tide. And so we claimed a lot of responsibility for helping to end the war. Now, if you're looking at our deaths in various wars that we have been involved in, 53,000 people died as a result of World War I. Now, where does this other 112 come from? Well, there were deaths. These were people who died later on, people who might have been wounded, people who and then passed away. But a lot of it was due to illness. So over half of our troops who perished died from illness and disease related to the war. Americans wanted to be very involved in the peace talks, and so we sent Edmund House from Houston, Texas, was sent to negotiate peace treaties. And he and Wilson were very close. House had been one of Wilson's behind-the-scenes proponents during the war. He had been a big supporter of Wilson, and so Wilson tagged him to go lead the peace treaty. Wilson himself was the first president to go overseas for a peace treaty. And he went and he led the delegation from the United States, all Democrats. And he faced a lot of problems. Wilson had this 14 points plan, this plan for peace after the war, but it seemed that none of the other European powers were really that interested. The big four. This was France. This was Italy. This was England. They wanted to punish Germany, and what they did was they took away a lot of German land, they seized German territory, they took apart the army and navy that the Germans had, they demilitarized the Rhine zone, the area along the Rhine River. They forced Germany to sign a guilt clause. Although it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that had declared war, they blamed Germany because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had dissolved. And Germans were also saddled with billions and billions of dollars in reparations. This is what they owed these other countries because they admitted to the guilt of the war. Now, of all the 14 points, really the only one that was accepted was Wilson's plan for a League of Nations, and he was very happy about that. He said, despite the fact that the other points of his plan weren't accepted, that was okay because the League of Nations would solve many of the problems. So on June 28, 1919, the European countries signed the Treaty of Versailles. However, when President Wilson brought the treaty back home for American ratification in the Senate, he faced an uphill battle because he refused to compromise and refused to give up on the League, but he faced powerful problems at home in the Senate. There was a group called the Irreconcilables, and they wanted to keep the United States out of European politics. They were isolationists. On the other hand, you had people who wanted to sign the treaty, but they had some questions about it. Maybe they weren't sure about all the provisions. These are called reservationists, and they were led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who wanted some adjustments, and he helped to delay vote on the ratification of the treaty. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles was doomed here in the United States. Wilson went on tour to gain public support for the treaty, but he had been ill, and his doctors told him to rest, not to go on this train ride across Europe, across the United States, to build up support for the treaty. And he eventually had to cancel the treaty, and then he suffered a stroke and was severely incapacitated and may really not have been acting as the president. It may have fallen to his wife to carry out his daily duties. And so this really hurt the ratification of the treaty. The Senate agreed to finally pass the treaty with some changes, some amendments, but Wilson was against that. And many of the Democrats followed Wilson's lead and voted against the treaty. And so when the treaty came up for the final vote, it failed to meet the required numbers, and the United States never signed a peace treaty to end World War I. Now, there were some issues after World War I that also drew American attention away from what was going on and the treaty. One of the big sicknesses that killed many Americans, and in fact people all over the world, was the Spanish influenza. For a year, the Spanish flu decimated people in Europe the United States and the rest of the world. Then there was also a lot of labor unrest. There were race riots that erupted. There was a fear of communist and Bolshevikism, the Red Scare. And there were severe economic problems that the United States had to face. And so, at the end of 1920, when Americans went to the polls, they wanted a presidential candidate who had promised to return to normalcy, to bring things back to where they were, and to get away from all of the foreign involvement. And that was Republican Warren G. Harding. He defeated his Democratic candidates, which included, ironically enough, James Cox and a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt as vice president, but they were defeated in a landslide by the Republican ticket of Harding. And so this return to normalcy, Americans wanted to return to the way things were before the war, and that marked the end of our involvement in World War I. What comes next in the 1920s and in the 1930s is America much more isolationist, much more concerned about problems at home, and the attention is drawn away from European affairs. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.